Hi, everybody, and welcome to another week of Poly 130 Virtual Style. Today, we're going to be talking about a totally new topic. This is one of the last new topics we'll get to. We actually only have 2 more full weeks of the course, so sad face. It's almost over for us. But anyway, we're going to be talking about contentious politics and mostly social revolution over the next 2 lectures. But before we get into that, let's get into this housekeeping. So first thing on the housekeeping agenda is that your paper is due today, April 13th. So I know it's hard to keep track of time during this quarantine, but today is April 13th. So it's the day that your paper is due. And it's going to be due by 11:55 p.m. So make sure that you turn your paper in on the relevant Sakai site, either your TA's website or if you're in the honors class on our class site by 11:55 p.m. The other thing is that the reflection paper topics for this week have been released, so those are attached to the announcement for the lecture today. So if you plan on writing a reflection paper, please open that document up, look at those prompts, and respond to one of them. The last thing is that our provost, Robert Bluen, is trying to get a sense of how people are adapting to online instruction. And so I have attached a survey on virtual instruction and posted it in an announcement on Sakai. So I would really ask that you all try and fill that out. That survey will be open for the remainder of the week. So please fill that out so that I can alert the provost as necessary to anybody who's having any particular problems, what the nature of those problems are, so that we can try to work this out as a university campus. If you are taking courses over the summer, you know that summer courses are still going to be online. So I think the university is just trying to make a concerted effort to preempt any problems that people are having with the online platform. So please fill out that survey. It's going to help all of us, I think, do this a little bit better in the future if we have to keep doing virtual instruction. Okay, so that's all the housekeeping. So let's get into the new questions for this week. The first question is, what is contentious politics? Remember, we always, when we get to a new topic, we start with the definitional question. So we're going to ask ourselves and answer for ourselves what contentious politics even means. Why do people actually participate in contentious activity? And then why does contention sometimes turn violent and take on the form of revolution? So the whole really 2 weeks or the whole week that we're going into, plus a kind of a lecture next week, are really about revolution as a specific form of contentious action. And so we really want to figure out, how do we get from, kind of plain contention, boycotts, protests, etc., to these big episodes, these huge revolutionary episodes. Okay, so to answer the first question of what is contentious politics, there's a lot of definitions, but I think a really kind of robust one is that contentious politics is extra institutional political activity that's supposed to create change in either the social, economic, or political agenda of the government, the regime, or the state. So that is kind of ambiguous, right? What does extra institutional activity mean? Well, it means activity outside of political institutions that we're familiar with. So voting is not contentious politics because voting fits well within the electoral institutions that we're used to. But contentious politics would be signing a petition, for example. There's no real institution that deals with petitions. Any boycotts or boycotts that you might participate in, sit-ins and protests, strikes. Getting on the more kind of extreme side, we have riots, civil wars or political violence, terrorism, and the big one that we're going to talk about this week, revolutions. So these protests can vary, right? Contentious activities can vary a lot, not only in their type, but also in their aims, right? So there are some protests like the Women's March that happened in 2016, I believe, that are, maybe it was 2017. Yeah, it was 2017. That are meant to draw awareness to a situation. So it's not exactly that people were advocating for any particular policy changes. They were just kind of protesting against the ascendance to power of someone that they believed might have anti-female stances, and trying to draw awareness to the issue of women's empowerment, and really the need for laws to protect women. But other protests are much more concrete in terms of what they are trying to get out of the state. So in the wave of Arab Spring protests that happened in 2011 or 2010, 2011, they kind of varied in demand, but some of them were very explicit about the things that they wanted. In Tunisia and Egypt, for example, there were explicit protest slogans that asked for the fall of the regime, right? That the government in place would no longer be in place, and that the real aim was regime change from an autocracy to a democracy. Consistent with having different aims, we can also think of contentious action as having different effects, right? Different types and different effects. So we can think of it as a spectrum. And on the one side, we can think of protests that maybe have no effect at all, really don't change anything in particular. And those might be movements like Occupy Wall Street, or the similar movement in Spain, the 15M movement in Spain, right? These movements happened. They did have aims to change the structure of government or the structure of the economy in some way, but really no substantive change actually came out of those protests, right? So the kind of distribution of income is about the same. Capitalism is just about the same as it was before these things happened. And so there really wasn't a big effect of that. There are other protests that actually result in some type of policy change. So the Tiananmen Square protests, which we've already talked about, and the Arab Spring or Feb 20th protests in Morocco are ones that actually resulted in concrete policy changes. So in Morocco, for example, the goal was to make changes to the constitution, right? To change some of the language, to make the official language of Morocco both Arabic and Amazigh, to have certain powers devolved to the parliament versus the king, things like this. And they actually did achieve some of those policy changes. There was a revised constitution put into place. And so there were actual reforms made as a consequence of those protests. On the other hand, there are protests that aim for regime change. We've seen a lot of protests like that. So in Eastern Europe, there were a series of protests called the Colored Revolutions, denoted by the fact that each revolution had a color name. So the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, etc. Plaza del Mayo protests in places like Chile and Argentina, where mothers kind of came together to try to change the regime in the 1980s from these bureaucratic authoritarian military regimes to more democratic regimes. Like I mentioned, the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, the Tahrir Revolution, or February 15th Revolution in, January 25th, revolution in Egypt. All of those were aiming towards changing the regime from an autocracy to a democracy. There are civil wars, and we've seen some examples of things like that. So a very famous one is kind of the Intifada in Palestine. The Tamil Liberation Movement for Sri Lanka is another big civil war. The Darfur Civil War, like all of these things are aimed to fundamentally change what the government structure looks like to create new states. And then there's revolutions. And there are several of them, but some of the more famous ones, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution. You've probably heard of all of those before. And these are kind of the most expansive acts that can be undertaken in contentious politics, one of the biggest effects. So why do people even participate in this type of contention anyway? Why do they participate in protests or revolutions, civil wars, etc.? Well, there are a lot of different ways to understand participation. But one of the main kind of points of confusion about why participation happens, like typically we think of, oh, people have some type of goal that they want to achieve. So for the Black Lives Matter movement, people really see a problem in the world with how police treat African Americans and Black people. They want to see a change in that. And so they come together collectively to make sure to affect that change, right? That's how we think of these things happening. But there's a really big problem with that. So, one, in a lot of places, the cost of actually participating in a protest are somewhat high. So in the United States, perhaps the cost of participating in a protest are that you have to take time off from work, that maybe you run the risk of getting arrested. So sometimes the costs of participation are high, but they can be higher in other places. In autocratic countries, you might, face the threat of death. In addition to all of kind of the other things, imprisonment, etc. So the cost of participating in a protest is particularly high, which might make people not want to participate. And you can see that kind of here as there's police presence at a protest in Ferguson, right? So there's some risk of this person possibly getting arrested or getting hurt at a protest. And then the other problem is that the benefits from collective action, from participating in this protest, are non-excludable. And what that means is that they're subject to this thing called a free rider problem. So if I attend a protest, right, and the goal is to, I don't know, let's say I attend a protest to make people switch from virtual education. What we really want is to get back into the classrooms, right? I know that this can be risky, particularly in this environment. If I attend a public protest, I'm exposing myself to various health risks, etc. But say I get what we wanted, right? Somehow this protest achieves exactly what we want. Everybody who didn't participate in the protest still gets the good, right? We still all go back to class, and we all get to kind of benefit from being able to have graduation and see our friends and all this stuff, but they didn't have to assume the risk. So their incentive is just to stay at home and let somebody else assume the risk in the hopes that they get the thing that we want. And that's what we call the free rider problem. That the idea that somebody that to actually get the good that we all want, people actually don't have to participate. They can kind of free ride on the action of others. And so people generally might not want to participate. And we can kind of see that happening here in this really cool cartoon from The Simpsons. What we see is Mr. Burns free riding on Smithers' efforts. So Smithers is actually doing all the work, and Mr. Burns gets to enjoy the ride, right? Enjoy the benefits of getting from point A to point B. And because of that, there are incentives for non-participation, right? So in general, it's kind of curious why anyone would participate in these protests, because if the cost of participation is high, if the benefits, you can't exclude people who didn't participate in the protest from kind of achieving the benefits of protest, then why would anyone want to participate? And that's the main question that kind of political science and sociology has tried to deal with, is why do people even participate in contentious activity or collective action if there are such strong incentives just to stay home, right? To not do anything. And there are several different theories for why this happens. So one of those is the Marxist theory. There are grievance-based theories. And then the really other big one is about political opportunities. So we're going to go through each of these and see what they have to say. So first up is Marxism. And as we know, that Marxism from like 2 classes ago is all about class struggle, right? So all political conflict kind of revolves around this class struggle. And so when we get participation in protest, when we get participation in contention, the reason is because someone has rejected the current class hierarchy and they're trying to change it, right? They want to change the way that the hierarchy exists. And so we get collective action. So in this case, and typically in the Marxist case, it's workers who feel exploited. They don't like that they're at the bottom of the totem pole, and so they come together to create this mighty fist that strikes a blow to capitalism, and we get collective action, and we get change based on that. But the problem here is that these types of like grievances, right? The grievance associated with exploitation, with not being at the top of the hierarchy, don't cleanly correlate with protests. There are poor people everywhere, right? There are workers everywhere, and it is not the case that that workers often rise up against capitalism. In fact, the poorest among us don't tend to protest that often. Keep in mind that I said that one of the costs of participating in protests is that you have to get time off from work, right? You have to have some free time to be able to do this. In general, poor people don't have that much free time. They are using all of their free time to work to make money, right? To be able to survive. So we often don't see the poorest among us protest. And in fact, protests tend to be led by those middle class people, right? The kind of upper middle class people that have a little bit of extra time on their hands. So Marxist theory just hasn't really been borne out all that often, despite the fact that, you know, tons of people suggest that this is the right thing to do. Another theory focuses on grievances as well, but slightly more in a slightly different way. And really what they're focusing on is relative grievance. So they still think that, yeah, there's this class hierarchy, and that may be problematic, but that people aren't worried about just being at the bottom rung of society. They are worried about their position relative to others, or relative to where they think they should be. And we talked about this, but for kind of collective action, the idea is that the motivation to protest is one's economic condition relative to others' condition. So we think that we deserve these types of living standards. What we're actually getting is this. And so since we're so far from what we deserve, or what we feel we deserve, or what we feel others have, we're more likely to protest at this point, when we realize, oh my gosh, what my expectation for my life is not in line with what my life actually is. And so I'm going to go out on the streets and I'm going to protest to change my situation. Well, the problem with this, again, is that grievances are still not a kind of a one-to-one correlation with protest. I must say I'm pretty satisfied with certain aspects of my life, but, you know, I'm not particularly satisfied with certain things that are going on in the political environment right now. However, I'm not on the streets protesting either. You know, I haven't devoted my extra time to protest. So even though I might have a lot of political grievances, I am not a person who has, you know, used kind of all of that energy and all of that grievance to go out and protest. And I'd imagine that there are a lot of people like me, right? People who don't really translate all of their anger into action. So the fact that there are grieved people everywhere, but not protest all the time, kind of shows that grievances can't be the only thing that are motivating protests. And then, so just that idea that everybody has something to be aggrieved about, and yet they're not protested every single second of the day, means that even this kind of relative deprivation theory of grievances isn't good enough to explain protest. So the third theory that we kind of have on board is the political opportunity theory. And this one looks at kind of the ways that institutions or politics might shape protests. So here, the nature of institutions and the political structure that's in existence will either encourage or discourage people from participating in protests. And the idea that political opportunity, i.e. is the system open or closed, And organizational resources matter for protests is really the central idea that, right, we need to know if there is a hospitable environment for people to protest and how many resources do people have at their behest to engage in protests. And so protests should be a lot easier in systems that are politically permissive, and where there are organizations that have a lot of resources to devote to protests. And we can kind of see some of this at play when we look at protests like the Women's March that happened in 2017. Millions of people came out. There was no real threat of arrest or intervention. There were women's organizations that helped to mobilize people, bus people out, etc. And then we can look at kind of the lack of participation in February 20th protests in Morocco. So even though the grievances were probably a lot higher in this case, right? They wanted regime change. They wanted changes in the minimum wage, really substantive changes. Not a lot of people came out to protest, in part because Morocco was an authoritarian country. So it was much more risky. Organizations in Morocco are a lot weaker and are not known for being able to mobilize a lot of people in the population. So there is some sense that in kind of these more permissive environments, we get bigger protests and more participation. In less permissive environments, it actually discourages people from participating in protests. But all the same, institutions, while they do seem to matter, and if you haven't figured out by now, I'm a big fan of institutions and institutional explanations, they're still not determinative, right? Of the countries in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, Tunisia was thought to be one of the most repressive, right? It was the least likely case for us to see a big mass political protest, and yet that's exactly what happened. And not only was there mass participation in these protests, they were the ones that were successful, right? They successfully resulted in regime change from an autocratic regime under Ben Ali to a democratic regime under kind of like a coalition government. So institutions don't necessarily determine the course of action, even though they can provide some of the explanation. Also, institutional theories have trouble explaining individual participation, right? So it should explain why everybody doesn't participate or why everybody does, but it doesn't explain why some people participate and some don't. So that's kind of problematic. And then finally, you have to really ask yourself, if institutions are that important, why don't people just always design institutions so that they block protests, right? Why doesn't everyone institute a closed political environment? And so these are kind of some of the hang-ups with institutional theories. But now that we have all of these on board, we can kind of get to the essential question that we'll be preoccupied with for the next 2 lectures, possibly 3, which is, why is it that contentious action kind of escalates to the form of revolution in certain cases, while in others it doesn't? So to answer this question, we first need a good definition of what a revolution is and how it differs from other forms of contention. We already saw a little bit that it's definitely more extreme, but Theda Skocpol gives us a really concrete definition of what a social revolution is. She says that revolutions are rapid and basic transformations of a society's state and class structures. Sorry about the misspelling of structures. They are accompanied and in part carried out through class-based revolts from below, and they're different from other conflicts in the sense that they have societal structural change with class upheaval and social and political transformation. There's a lot of words, but I'm going to break it down for you. So basically, remember we had this this triangle with government, regime, and state. So certain protests might try to change the government. Others, like the ones in Tunisia, might try to change the regime. But what revolutions do is they fundamentally change the nature of the state. An advisor of mine who taught the version of this course at Harvard used to say, to achieve revolution, you have to break the state, right? You have to completely overhaul all state institutions. So it's not just getting one guy out of power or a set of guys out of power. It's about changing like the fundamental institutions of the state. It's about changing the economic structure of the state, like the social structure of the state, kind of everything changes in these revolutions. And we've seen a couple revolutions well, not in our lifetime really, but over the course of the historical record. So one thing to note is that revolution is very rare because it involves such a big transformation. It doesn't typically happen all that often. But some of the notable revolutions that we can come up with are the French Revolution, right? And that is where we saw kind of the way that classes were organized in France was upended, the monarchy upended, like all of these changes happening all at once. The Mexican Revolution in 1910, the Chinese Revolution in 1911, the Russian Revolution, which was a huge one, right? The entire, I don't think it's called a czarship. What is it? I don't know what the noun version, the nominal version of czardom, I don't know, but basically we saw the exodus of the czar, right? So that was completely changed into a communist government. The economic hierarchy entirely changed, right? So that was again a major overhaul of the system in place. There was the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1945. A Vietnamese revolution that same year, the Cuban Revolution, Algerian Revolution, Zimbabwe had a revolution, the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Again, a huge change from a personalistic a system of power where we had a dictator at the head, right, and kind of passed along through familial lines to now an Islamic theocracy. So right, not just a regime change, but an entire change of the social system in Iran. The Haitian Revolution in 1986. So these are kind of the I guess two handfuls or so of revolutions, a bunch of revolutions that we had over time. This is a particularly rare phenomenon. As you can see, if these are the kind of only cases that we can count, there aren't a lot of times that this has happened over the course of history. So how do we explain how these very rare events happen? Now, remember when I talked about civil wars, I said that rare events are super important because they often involved major changes or major costs to human life or something like that. So it's very important that we be able to explain this rare event of revolutions. And we can look at our different theories, right? We could look at Marxism, grievances, and political opportunities all as possible explanations for this. And we already kind of have thrown out two of those. Marxism and grievances are very difficult to explain because, again, they're all based on this idea that people are upset about the social hierarchy in some way, and they want to protest to change it. But if that were true, if that was the only reason why people revolted, then we would have many more revolutions than we actually see, right? Because people are aggrieved all the time. So that kind of leaves us with these kind of political opportunity structure arguments. And that is what you read today. That is basically what Theda Skocpol says in her book, that these Marxism and these grievance-based theories are not good enough. So we need to start looking at more structural theories. And so Theda Skocpol, who, by the way, is a woman, wrote a really big tome on social revolution. It's called States and Social Revolution, in which she tries to really attack that question. So her study looks at the causes of social revolutions in France, China, and Russia. And her main puzzle is, right, people, again, this idea that people have grievances, but revolutions are rare. So what is the cause of revolution, right? Why does this really happen? And her answer focuses on the structure of society. So in agrarian bureaucracies that have been defeated militarily, well, when we get the combination of agrarian bureaucracy, a military defeat, and popular insurrection, we get states falling apart, and then revolutions can be carried out. Now, if you've read Skocpol and you were like, I can't wrap my head around this, I really don't understand what's going on, do not despair. It is very very kind of dense, and it's a hard theory to get. But I'm going to try to explain it here, and there's going to be a video linked at the end of this video, like a short, like 10, I think it's I don't even think it's 10 minutes. It's a very short explainer that I think really does a great job of spelling out exactly what is going on. But we're going to try to do that a little bit here. So don't fret. So the big thing for Skocpol is that revolutions begin with an economic crisis. States kind of face these economic crises because modernization happens. So something like the Industrial Revolution happens. And remember when we studied modernization, we said that one of the consequences of modernization, things like the Industrial Revolution is happening, is that it puts all of the states around Great Britain into a period of political crisis, right? Because they need to figure out how to catch up. And that is exactly what she says, right? In this first phase of modernization, there was immediate pressure for European states to catch up, to reform, and it was difficult to do for those kind of relatively backward states who didn't have the same type of machinery. So we have this economic crisis that sends kind of all of these countries into a tailspin, and they have three options for what they're going to be able to do. Either they can initiate reforms, right, so that they can catch up to Great Britain and do their own industrialization. They can kind of set off a rebellion where people kind of protest against the bad economic conditions that haven't been fixed, or it could lead to a potential revolution, right? A complete overhaul of the state, its institutions, the economic system, the social system, etc. And what she thinks is really important for understanding this is that this is not a random choice, right? States don't see these three choices and just decide what to pick. Rather, what path you're going to go down is determined by some pre-existing social structure. So again, the important things that you need to have to get the revolution is you need to have an agrarian bureaucracy, you need to have you need to face a military defeat, and then there needs to be some type of popular insurrection. So the first step is having an agrarian bureaucracy, and that is a term that you probably haven't heard before, but the definition is simply a state in which we have landed elites that are in political positions, right? And they're responsible for running the day-to-day functions of the government. Now, these people may be subordinate to a higher power, right? There may be a monarch in power, but basically landed elites have a lot of power in the political system. So kind of like Downton Abbey, right? These kind of rich aristocrats who have manners and things like that are also, I actually must confess I've never watched Downton Abbey, but they're very much involved with the political system. And so they can help make the decision of whether we're going to initiate reforms or whether we're going to do something else. And the problem with these agrarian bureaucracies are as follows. Again, they're occupying government offices, so they have a lot of sway over political decision making. But they're reluctant to carry out reforms to change the economic system slowly over time, right? They don't actually want any resources to be allocated to modernization so that they can play this catch-up game. And remember, we talked about this when we were talking about modernization, that a big problem with achieving economic development and industrialization is that when you have a lack of land reform, when you have a big landed elite, they don't want their resources to go to modern enterprise, right? And so we see this kind of tug of war between the people that own these large estates and large farms and industrialists. So when we have the landowners in power, we don't see reform and slow policy change to get to industrialization. So that is problem one with the agrarian bureaucracy. And when we have that, the reform option basically goes away, right? So we used to have three potential roads we could go down. But when we have the landed bureaucracy in power, or the landed elite in power and the agrarian bureaucracy in power, then the reform option goes away. That's no longer something that we can do. So we can either have a rebellion or we can have a revolution. Now, one of the other problems with agrarian bureaucracies is they tend to be very vulnerable to military weakness. And the reason for that being that they just don't have the types of equipment or the types of resources that the state can invest into protecting themselves, defending themselves against more industrialized challengers. So then military defeat comes in as the second part in the chain to get us to revolution. Again, military defeat, the big problem is that it destabilizes the state. So once you have been defeated by an external power, all aspects of your state become a lot weaker, right? The monarchy becomes a lot weaker. The banking system possibly becomes exhausted. Your political institutions, people lose faith in them. And so we have a general destabilization of the state. And we can see that in a lot of different cases. So for France, there was a lot of money spent, a lot of resources spent on the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the American Independence War. We saw the transition to Russia's revolution happen after their mass defeat in World War I, which cost them tons of lives, cost them tons of money. And then in China, the Taiping Rebellion and the kind of resources and the effort it took to deal with that also weakened the Chinese state, helping to facilitate their own revolution. So, like I said, in Russia, the big thing was after their defeat in World War II, that kind of exacerbated their economic crisis even further, kind of giving people even more reason to participate in these types of revolutions. And then the last thing that comes into play is popular insurrection, right? So if we have the agrarian bureaucracy and the military defeat, we could go to the rebellion stage. But once we get the popular insurrection, we're headed on a bullet train to revolution. And so kind of the root of what popular insurrection is the coming together of peasants and middle class workers to oppose the state. And the reason this happens is that, to begin with, peasants are making a lot of money for the state, but they are on the lowest rungs of society. So this kind of incorporates that grievance thing that we talked about. So, unfortunately, this picture is super small. I'll change it in the slides, in the slides that I post online. But in general, we can think of capitalism as being along a hierarchy. Here, the peasants are at the lowest rung, and the picture is so much better when it is actually blown up, because there's a guy here on the side that's holding a shovel and is trying to beat somebody on the upper rungs with the shovel. So you can tell that these people are exploited, right? They're doing all the work. And that makes them very angry, right? It makes them feel as though they want to change their circumstances. So that's the first step. But it's not just that they feel exploited, right? Peasants also have to be able to be organized, because again, remember that the poorest people often aren't the ones who organize social revolutions. So we have to figure out a way to get these peasants together, to get them want to act collectively. So they have to have some type of autonomy from the landed classes to be able to organize collectively. So in general, we think of peasants as existing kind of like this, right? So they're all kind of atomized, not really aggregated together. But what we need, according to Skocpol, is to have some type of institutionally based collective solidarity and autonomy from direct day-to-day supervision in order to get these peasants to act collectively and oppose the state. And so what we need is something like a Zemstvo, which Zemstvos were groups of peasants that came together in Russia, and it used to be just kind of a collective way for people who were kind of day laborers to come together to like eat lunch, to socialize with one another, etc. But eventually, this turned into an actual estate, kind of, in Russia, that was able to participate in political institutions, right? And so they were able to have some effect over the political system through these Zemstvos. And then what you need is for marginalized urban elites to also join in on the protest. So once we get the urban elites who are also aggrieved and they come together, oh dear, this is terrible. This is quite embarrassing. This picture did not come through. So again, it's a thing I'm going to have to change on the slides that I put on Sakai. This was a picture of basically kind kind of tons of people protesting together. But once those all come together, right, we get urban elites coming together with the peasants, then we get this huge popular insurrection that eventually will break the state. And so the big thing that Skotchpole says is that revolutions aren't made, they end up coming, right? So we get all of this and we get revolution. So you can't just have individuals make a revolution. They only come when you have all three of these parts together. So there are some problems with Skotchpole's theory that people have critiqued her for. So one of the problems is that she doesn't pay enough attention to individuals, right? Individual action. Again, the idea is that revolutions aren't made by individuals. They just come. So if you have these three things, you're always going to get a revolution. Doesn't matter who's the leader, who participates, whatever, you're always going to get that. But people say, no, actually the actions of individuals do matter. So these are our voluntarists who really think that we should be paying attention to how individuals foment revolution, how they encourage people to protest, etc. And then structural explanations don't really provide a big enough role for ideology. So some revolutions are ideological. Some people say that the Iranian revolution is highly ideological, based around the idea of Islam. And how can we explain a revolution like that if we don't pay attention to ideology, if we just pay attention to these structural factors? So next class, we're going to talk about some of these cases that don't fit well within the framework that Skotchpole lays out by looking at social revolution in the third world, looking specifically at Cuba in the next lecture. And what I would like for you to do is the reading. That's the main thing. Again, I'm so sorry for some of the errors in the presentation. I should have done my due diligence to make sure that everything was fine, but I will update the right stuff on Sakai. And watch this video linked at the end of this if you're still having problems understanding Skotchpole and want a really quick and thorough explainer. Okay, I will see you guys next class. Talk to you later. Bye.